Thank you. Oh, thank you. I'm just the messenger, truly. Thank you, Janet. Thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you for inviting me. I also want to thank Melissa Riley, who works at the West Portal branch of the there you are, at the SFPL, for suggesting that we have this discussion tonight. And I got to tell you, I love the SF Public Library, and so should you. And the reason I love it is because they have fiction and they have nonfiction. But there's one thing they don't have. They don't have fake news, which is fiction masquerading as nonfiction. But tonight we're going to talk about the fourth group. That is the nonfiction that masquerades as fiction. And what I'm going to argue is that you're all caught in the matrix, a fictitious assembly of things that you don't know about, that have been hidden from you. And I'm going to try to expose that over the course of the next hour and a half. Okay. So I do have some disclosures. I did write these two books, one we're talking about tonight. I am the chief science officer of this nonprofit called Eat Real, which certifies restaurants, hospital cafeterias, schools that serve real food, with the idea that by doing a bottom-up effort, we can actually teach people what is real food and try to get processed food out of our lives, because that's where the big problem is. And also, I am the chief medical officer of a for-profit company called Slendine, which is developing specific products to try to mitigate the metabolic risks associated with processed food, because as much as I would like it, processed food ain't never going away because there's just too much money involved. But as long as health hangs in the balance, we have to do something to try to mitigate it. We have some ideas on how we might be able to do that. And so that's a for-profit company, and I, will stand by that. Okay, so those are my disclosures. So I have a very modest agenda tonight. Hopefully by the end of the evening, we will solve the healthcare crisis, solve the Social Security crisis, solve the opioid crisis, solve the depression crisis, which no one's talking about, and make America happy again. Okay. So let's start here. Let's start with healthcare. Anybody know this guy? Anybody ever seen him before?
Brother of Rahm Emanuel.
That's right. Ezekiel Emanuel, brother of Rahm Emanuel, mayor of Chicago. Sorry? I don't know that. He's at University of Pennsylvania. He's a bioethicist and hematologist oncologist, and he's also the architect of Obamacare. That's right. Well, he wrote this article in The Atlantic 3 years ago now, Why I Hope to Die at 75, because he had to justify why Obamacare. Now, to be honest with you, if you read this article, it's pretty horrible. And the reason it's horrible is because he misses the entire point. Not once in the entire article is the word diet ever mentioned. And we're going to spend a lot of time on that as we go through this, okay? So, I hope not to die at 75. I hope to die much later and hope be much healthier than our current 75-year-olds are. And the reason is because I think I understand what's going on, and I'm going to try to convey that to you tonight. So the question on our minds is, did Obamacare deliver? Sorry, move it closer? Oh, okay, because is that better? Yes. Okay. Did Obamacare deliver? So, Obamacare promised to put 32 million sick people onto the rolls, and believe it or not, it's still the law of the land, although the individual mandate is now gone, which is going to create major problems. The point is that President Obama told us that we could pay for this by providing preventative services. That is, by having everybody have access to medical care, to their doctor, that we could keep people healthier and out of the emergency room where costs are 50 times higher. That's the idea. So that creates cartoons like this. The government can't make me buy health insurance, and why would I when I can just go here and you'll pay for it? And now that we've lost the individual mandate because of the tax reform bill, in fact, we'll be paying for it. Okay? We will be paying for it because now they won't be paying for it. So even worse. Well, here's the fallacy of Obamacare. In fact, we didn't keep people out of the emergency room. There's been an actual uptick in emergency room visits to the point where healthcare plans had to increase their premiums by over 25%, and 3 of the insurers left the exchanges entirely, Aetna, Humana, and United, which of course led to the election of 2016. I think you all remember that. Wasn't that long ago. Okay? In fact, if you look at what's going on in terms of the dollar amount, it's been enormous. A $100 billion increase per year in just 4 years, just for diabetes alone, never mind everything else. And 75% of all the healthcare dollars spent in this country are for chronic metabolic disease. So you can see, this is breaking the bank. And if these people don't have to even pay for the individual mandate, how in the world are we going to be able to provide health care? Trump Care, which is not really there, but is really there, ultimately says this, because this is Nick Mulvaney, OMB director, who says, got diabetes? Your fault. You brought it on yourself. No health care for you, like the soup Nazi. The point is that this is predicated on 2 inconvenient truths that no one wants to utter, but I'm going to utter them. The first is, there is no medicalized prevention for chronic metabolic disease. There's only treatment. There's treatment for hypertension, there's treatment for high lipids, there's treatment for heart disease, there's treatment for type 2 diabetes, but there's no prevention. No one's talking about what it takes to prevent those diseases, and until we prevent them, we can't afford them. This is a meta-analysis of type 2 diabetes prevention strategies that just came out about 2 months ago now. Okay? And if you look at the diamond over here, okay, it is to the left of the identity line, which means that it is statistically significant. These prevention strategies work, whether it be lifestyle or whether it be drugs. Here's the problem. Here's the relative risk for lifestyle. Here's the relative risk for medicines. So you say, well, that's good. These things work. But here's the real problem. The number needed to treat, the NNT, which is the really important thing, 25. You have to treat or prevent 25 different people to be able to prevent one of them from going on to develop diabetes. And currently, we have a 9.4% diabetes rate and a 40% pre-diabetes rate in this country. If we have a number needed to treat of 25 for these strategies, we ain't never going to catch up. That's what this comes down to, irrespective of whether these things, quote, work or not. We can't do it. The second inconvenient truth is you can't fix healthcare till you fix health. And you can't fix health until you fix diet. And you can't fix diet until you know what the hell's wrong. And that's where I came in. What the hell is wrong? So this is what we thought was wrong. Everybody remember this? 1984, it's all about dietary fat, all about cholesterol, all about heart disease, get your cholesterol down. Everybody said, get rid of the saturated fat, et cetera, et cetera. You know that story. Okay. So we did it. And this is what happened instead. This is the unintended consequence. And this was from 2001. It is now 2018, and it is 20 times worse. Here's the fiction. It's on this slide. Any of you watch football? Okay, about 5 years ago, this was on every football game, every telecast, one of the commercials from Coca-Cola, a 2-minute video called Coming Together. And this is a direct quote from that video. It said, "Beating obesity will take action by all of us based on one simple common sense fact. All calories count, no matter where they come from, including Coca-Cola and everything else with calories." Direct quote. So as far as they're concerned, you can get your calories from carrots, or you can get your calories from cheesecake, or you can get your calories from Coca-Cola, or you can get your calories from kumquats. Doesn't matter. Because it's the first law of thermodynamics, which says energy can neither be created nor destroyed, just shifted around, which in human terms means energy balance. Therefore, it's about calories in, calories out. Therefore, it's about diet and exercise. Therefore, if you're fat, it's your fault, because these are two behaviors that you are presumably in charge of yourself. Therefore, any calorie can be part of a balanced diet. Therefore, don't pick on our calories, go pick on somebody else's calories. All of that comes from this simple mantra that a calorie is a calorie. And after all, it's common sense. Well, I don't believe in common sense. I believe in science. I believe in data. At UCSF, we have a motto. In God we trust, everyone else has to produce the data. That's called truth, as opposed to post-truth, which is what we have now. And who is it that's been saying a calorie is a calorie? Well, these guys. Familiar with all of them, right? They control 90% of the world's food. 90%. So they'll tell you it's about calories. It's about obesity. You get fat, you get sick. You get fat because you're a glutton and a sloth. All your fault. That's what they say. So the question is that true? What do you think? What does the science say? So on this slide, we have a scattergram. Obesity prevalence country by country on the x-axis, and diabetes prevalence country by country on the y-axis. And you would look at this scattergram and you say, well, very clearly, Dr. Lustig, there's clearly a correlation, and there it is. And indeed, there is a correlation. And I don't argue that, there's a correlation. But correlation is not concordance. They're not the same. Because we have countries that are obese without being diabetic, such as Iceland, Mongolia, Micronesia. And we also have countries that are diabetic without being obese, such as India, Pakistan, and China. India and China today have an 11% diabetes rate. We, the fattest nation on earth, have a 9.4% diabetes rate. If it's about obesity, how come the non-obese countries have more diabetes than we do? First problem. Second problem. Obesity is increasing worldwide by the annualized amortization rate of 2.78% per year over the past 40 years. Yet, diabetes is increasing at the amortization rate per year of 4.0% for those same years. If diabetes is just a subset of the larger subgroup of obese persons, then how can you explain the fact that the diabetes rate's going up faster? Well, you can't, because maybe it's not true. And finally, here's another piece of data. This is from JAMA, and it's looking at the secular trend over time in diabetes cases in the United States. Here's the total here. And we're going to look at the right side here first, okay? So here is the rate of increase in the obese population, a 25% increase in incidence per year within the obese population. However, there's also been a 25% increase in the incidence in the normal weight population too. If diabetes is really about obesity, how come the normal weight people are getting it just as fast? Problem number 3. This does not compute. So, this is the most important thing I'm going to tell you tonight. Here we have a Venn diagram of the entire US adult population. Okay, 240 million total. 30% obese in this circle, that's 72 million. 70% normal weight, 168 million. Mutually exclusive circles. Everybody got that? Everyone in this room is in one of the two circles. You got that, right? Okay. BMI over 30, BMI under 30. Everybody's in one of them. So here's the problem. The medical profession, the dietary profession, the Institute of Medicine, the National Institutes of Health, the Surgeon General, the White House, Congress, and the food industry say the following. 80% of those obese people, 80% of those people with a BMI over 30, these 57 million people, they're sick. They're fat, and they're sick because they're fat. And if they would only just diet and exercise, we could solve this problem. That's what they say. Garbage. Total, complete trash.
Who says that?
Everyone, except me. Why is it garbage? It's on the slide. Well, it is true that 80% of 30% are metabolically ill. I don't argue that. But that means that 20% are not. 20% are obese and healthy. We actually have a name for them. MHO, metabolically healthy obese. We study them to try to figure out how come they didn't get sick. They will live a completely normal life, die at a completely normal age, not cost the taxpayer a dime, are not the problem of Obamacare. They're just fat. Conversely, and this is the important part, 40% of the normal weight population, 40% of 70%, have the exact same diseases for the exact same reason as do the obese. They're just not obese. They get type 2 diabetes, they get hypertension, they get lipid problems, they get cardiovascular disease, they get cancer, they get dementia too. Now, they don't get it at the same prevalence, 80% versus 40%. So obesity is without question a risk factor. I don't argue that. Okay? If you're obese, you have a much greater chance of being sick than if you are normal weight. I don't argue that. That's true. But turns out, when you do the math, there's actually more thin sick people than there are fat sick people. And these are the ones who are saying it's their problem. And when you do the math on the whole thing, it's more than half the US population, which is what makes this a public health crisis. And if thin people get it too, how can it be about behavior? They're not eating too much and exercising too little because they're normal weight. This does not look like behavior. This looks like exposure. This looks like cholera or influenza or tuberculosis or something like that. Now, I'm not saying it's an infection, but it is an environmental exposure. The question is, what is the exposure that explains this? How do thin people get sick too, with the same chronic metabolic diseases that the fat people get? That's the question for tonight. And that's the question that no one in the medical profession and no one in Washington is asking or answering. And that's the fiction. And I'll prove it to you. So here are two equally weighted people. Notice trunk fat, 12.8, right there. Okay, equally weighted people. One of these people is healthy, one of these people is sick. Which one's the sick one, A or B? I heard both. B is the sick one. A, he's just got big love handles, known as subcutaneous fat, or big butt fat, if you will. Okay? Turns out big butt fat isn't particularly dangerous. Might be unsightly in a bathing suit, but not particularly dangerous. Whereas this guy, he's got fat all around his organs, intra-abdominal fat. He's got visceral fat, big belly fat. And everyone will tell you big belly fat's worse than big butt fat, yet they're equally weighted. And we have a name for this. It's called TOFI, T-O-F-I. Thin on the outside, fat on the inside, real medical term, swear to God, 1,500 Medline citations. Go look it up. And it turns out it's not even the visceral fat. It's worse than that. It's even deeper than that. So here is a metabolically healthy, obese person, MHO. Okay? I want you, so there are the love handles. You see those. I want you to take a look at this guy's liver right there. Nice and dark. Notice? Dark. 2.6% fat. That's actually pretty good. Okay? This guy has MHO. This is a healthy, obese person with a low liver fat. Now, here's another fat fraction map on somebody who has metabolic syndrome. Now, he has obesity. You can see the love handles there. Take a look at his liver. 24% liver fat. This guy's got all the metabolic diseases that you know about. Type 2 diabetes, fatty liver. That's fatty liver. That's what that is. Okay, everybody with me? Foie gras. Okay? No difference. Okay, and it looks the same. It looks the same under the microscope. It looks the same in the autopsy pan. Okay, it looks like foie gras. Well, here is a thin person. Notice, not too much in the way of love handles there, but take a look at his liver, 23%. This person is just as sick as the person in the center. Thin sick, fat healthy. So my question to you, sitting there now, are you a TOFI? Do you know? How would you know? Would your doctor know? How would he find out or she find out? That's what we're going to talk about. So maybe you'll teach your doctor something, which would be very good because most doctors don't know too much, as I have found out the hard way. In fact, the fat hypothesis has actually been debunked. And who debunked it first? The American Heart Association. Yet, if you go to the American Heart Association's website today, it's still up there. So this is from Ron Krause, who is just across the bay, Children's Oakland Research Institute, head of the nutrition committee of the AHA, who they have debunked it. But the AHA was so invested in this message, they're having a hard time walking it back. Now, they are walking it back. And I was actually a member of the board of directors of the Bay Area AHA, and I'm proud to say that we have, in fact, walked it back. But not every society has. For instance, the American Diabetes Association has not walked it back. In fact, they're still saying the same old thing. So, who do you trust? Who do you trust? Do you trust doctors or do you trust bankers? I trust bankers. And the reason I trust bankers is because they only have one directive: to make money. And they want to know what's going on in order to make money. And so they can look at data with a clear eye, without the bias that has come with the last 40 years. And that was what happened with this report called Credit Suisse Research Institute, and it's called The New Health Paradigm. And they looked at all the data without medical bias, and here's what they said. A high intake of omega-6 fats, that is vegetable oils, has not been proven as beneficial for our health, and trans fats have been shown to have negative health effects. The higher intake of vegetable oils and the increase in carbohydrate consumption in the last 30, 40 years are the two leading factors behind the high rates of obesity and metabolic syndrome in the United States. Saturated and monounsaturated fats are not. Exactly right. Couldn't agree more. Absolutely 100%. And I had nothing to do with this report. Okay? The bankers got it right because they looked at all the data and analyzed it without a bias because they want to know who to invest in. In fact, doctors are coming around, and this is an editorial that was in JAMA. Sorry, not JAMA, British Journal of Sports Medicine, sorry, another one coming from JAMA. Written by my colleague, Asim Malhotra, who is a member of the NHS Health Trust in Britain. Rita Redberg, who's here at UCSF, who is the editor-in-chief of JAMA Internal Medicine, and also Pascal Meyer, who happens to be the editor-in-chief of BMJ Open Heart. Not exactly lightweights. And they came out and said, saturated fat does not clog the arteries. Coronary heart disease is a chronic inflammatory condition, the risk of which can be effectively reduced by healthy lifestyle interventions. I couldn't agree more. It's not about the saturated fat. 40 years of saturated fat being taken out of our diet, and all we did was get sicker. Okay? In fact, the saturated fat is irrelevant. It does have to do with omega-3s and omega-6s. I don't argue that. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. It has to do with sugar and refined carbohydrate, which drives insulin resistance and systemic inflammation. And we think we know actually what the compound in the liver that causes this is, but I'm going to not tell you because we haven't proven it yet. But we think we know. And that's what's driving all of this. But that's not what we've been told, and it's still not what several societies, such as the American Diabetes Association, is saying today. So who do you trust? In fact, we wrote this editorial that came out 2 months ago. The cholesterol and calorie hypotheses are both dead. It's time to focus on the real culprit, insulin resistance. The fact that insulin's levels are high, but the insulin's not working. And because it's not working, the pancreas has to make extra. And it turns out the insulin itself is a bad actor in this story. The goal is to bring your insulin levels down. And how do you do that? Well, you get rid of the fatty liver. And how do you do that? That's where we're going. Okay, everybody with me? Turns out that fatty liver is worse than fat anywhere else in your body. And the reason is because that's the organ that the insulin works on, is the liver. Anybody know any anatomy? Any? Turns out the pancreas drains right into the liver. Now, the rest of the body, it goes artery, organ, vein, heart. But there are two places in the body where it goes artery, organ, vein, second organ, second vein, heart. Series, okay? It's called a portal system. There are two portal systems in the body. One is hypothalamus pituitary, and we know why that is. That's, as an endocrinologist, that's what I do. And pancreas liver, also endocrinologist, that's what I do. And the reason is because the liver is the primary target of insulin action. And when your liver's sick, you're sick. And that liver fat that I showed you before, it's the driver. And what is the driver of the liver fat? Sugar. Sugar. And that's what we have shown in a series of papers that have come out over the last couple of, about year and a half now, and you've probably seen them reported in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and on TV, and for good reason. Okay? And these are the three papers that we've had in obesity, atherosclerosis, gastroenterology. And here's what we've shown. So when you consume a lot of sugar, you end up with a lot of liver fat. And you also end up with a lot of triglyceride in your bloodstream called VLDL, very low density lipoproteins. Now, your doctor ignores those because he doesn't know what to do with them and he doesn't even know where they came from. Everyone thinks LDL is the problem. Turns out LDL is not nearly as dangerous as VLDL. VLDL has a hazard risk ratio for heart disease of 1.8. LDL has a hazard risk ratio for heart disease of 1.3. So it's at least 50% more dangerous and probably more. And your doctor isn't doing a damn thing about it. He's not even telling you about it, and he doesn't know what to do. She doesn't know what to do about it. And that's what we're talking about. Okay? So what we did was we took 43 kids from our clinic at UCSF who had metabolic syndrome, that is, obesity plus at least one of these comorbidities. And what we did was we figured out what they were eating at home on their normal diet, and we studied them on that normal diet. And then for the next 9 days, we took all of the added sugar out of their diet. We reduced their dietary intake of sugar from 28% of calories to 10% of calories. We got rid of all of the refined sugar. Got it? Now, if you do that, you're going to reduce the total caloric intake by 350 to 400 calories. And if you do that, then, well, people might lose weight. And if people lost weight, if these kids lost weight, then people would say, well, of course they got better, they lost weight. So we didn't want them to lose weight. We wanted them to stay the same weight. So we took the 350 to 400 calories out of the diet as sugar, and we put it back in as starch. So in the vernacular, we took the pastries out, we put the bagels in. We took the sweetened yogurt out, we put the baked potato chips in. We took the chicken teriyaki out, we put the turkey hot dogs in. Everybody got it? We didn't give them good food. We gave them crappy food. We gave them processed food. We gave them kid food. Food kids would eat, but it was no added sugar food. Everybody got that? And we didn't let them lose weight. 10 days. And then we brought them back and we studied them again at the same weight. Everybody got it? The liver fat went down like crazy. Their turning sugar into fat went down like crazy, and their VLDL went down by 49%. Okay? And their insulin got better. Their pancreas got put to rest because now the liver was healthy. And here's just an example of, here's the change in big butt fat, subcutaneous fat. No change, because we didn't let them lose weight. Here's the change in visceral or big belly fat, down 7%, that's good. And here's the change in liver fat, a 22% reduction in liver fat with no change in calories and no change in weight, just by getting rid of the offending agent, dietary sugar. Well, it turns out we've known about the problem of sugar for a long time. In fact, back in the 1960s, there was a battle going on between sugar and fat, that whole battle royal we talked about earlier. And it turns out that we gave up on sugar and fingered saturated fat as the bad guy. And we've altered the last 40 to 50 years of nutrition policy and information in this country based on that. And it turns out that it was all a fraud, all of it. And this is an example. And this was done by my colleagues at UCSF, Kristen Carnes, Laura Schmidt, and Stan Glantz, who unearthed the documents that demonstrated that the sugar industry had actually paid off to Harvard School of Public Health scientists, Fred Stair, the chairman of the Department of Nutrition at HSPH, and Mark Hegstead, his assistant, who became the head of the USDA back in the late 60s, who exonerated sugar as the problem and fingered saturated fat as the bad guy. And they got paid $6,500 in 1965 dollars, which would be equivalent to $50,000 today. They singled out fat and cholesterol as the dietary cause of coronary disease and downplayed evidence that sugar consumption was also a risk factor. The Sugar Research Foundation set the review's objective, contributed articles for inclusion, and received drafts. The Sugar Research Foundation's funding and role was not disclosed. It's been one big lie. It was a put-up job. You're sick because they took nonfiction and created fiction. Just like the tobacco industry. No different. So here's what happened at that exact same time with the advent of processed food, 1965, when these articles were coming out. Here's the growth of sugar, okay, in this country. We started out eating about 4 pounds per day from fruits and vegetables and the occasional honey. Here's the growth of the sugar industry like C&H and Domino, et cetera, you know, Louisiana, Texas, Hawaii. Here's stabilization when price met demand. Okay, here's the rationing of World War II right here. Came back to the same level, and then you get the advent of processed food and also the advent of high fructose corn syrup and the advent of the dietary guidelines for Americans saying cut the saturated fat, but the flavor was in the fat. So what did they do? They replaced it with sugar. And so we got up to 125 grams of sugar per day. We started out with 4, we ended up with 125. A 25-fold increase in one macronutrient, never been seen before in the history of man. And the question is, what did it do? The answer is, they added more salt too, but that's not what's driving this. Okay? Because there are plenty of countries that have plenty of excess salt, and they don't have this problem. This here is the percent of healthcare, percent of GDP in this country spent on healthcare. And what you can see is until 1965, it was relatively flat. And now look at it. This is the driver of this entire chronic metabolic disease debacle through this pathway. And this is why healthcare can't be fixed. We can't fix healthcare until we fix diet. We can't fix diet until we know what's wrong. Well, this is what's wrong. And no one's fixing it. So let's do the math. The food industry grosses in this country $1.4 trillion a year. Big number. Of which $657 billion is gross profit. So they're making a 45% gross profit margin on their revenue. Everybody got that? 45%. The next highest industry is big pharma at 18%. And everybody's yelling about big pharma being, you know, the thieves. Okay, 45%, 18%. Are you kidding me? Right? Yet, healthcare costs in the United States are $3.2 trillion a year, of which 75% is chronic metabolic disease, of which 75% of that would be preventable if we could go back to 1970 rates. So that's all added on, if you will. So if you do 75% of 75% is 3.2 trillion, you get $1.8 trillion a year going down a friggin' rat hole. We lose triple what the food industry makes. That is unsustainable. And that's why everything's going broke. And that's why Obamacare can't work. And that's why nothing can work. Now, what do you think we could do if we could recoup even a fraction of that $1.8 trillion a year? You think we could solve health care? You think we could solve the federal budget? Oh, yeah. We could solve the federal budget if we could recoup even half of that. But we can't recoup it because our food supply is contaminated by the industry because we like it. In fact, my colleagues at UCSF and I, Jim Kahn, Alex Goodell, Luis Rodriguez, what we did, and Rick Vreeman actually was the lead in this, what we did was we modeled using something called advanced Markov modeling going 20 years into the future based on what would happen to disease in terms of prevalence and incidence if we could reduce consumption of sugar by 20%, which would be like a tax, or 50%, which would be like actually adhering to USDA guidelines, so in blue and in red. And you can see the fatty liver disease, the heart disease, the type 2 diabetes, the obesity, all getting better. And if you looked at the amount of money that that would save, it would be on the order of about $50 billion a year just to start. And that would be just for just like 3 diseases. I mean, all the chronic disease. So that's healthcare. That's how to fix healthcare. Now let's look at Social Security. Now, you know that Social Security is a Ponzi scheme, right? You know that. Okay, the only difference between Bernie Madoff and Social Security is that with Bernie Madoff, you had a chance of seeing it back till the end. Okay, that's the difference. In fact, it's a pyramid scheme where the young, healthy people pay in at the bottom so that the old, infirm people at the top can take out. Everybody with me? That's how Social Security was built. And if you die before you hit 65, too bad, right? That's why the American government didn't do anything about cigarettes for so long. Because the actuaries had figured out that the median age of death of smokers was 64.
What year was this?
That was in 1980. They figured that out. They paid in, but they didn't take out, which was how the Social Security stayed afloat all those years. But now we have people with chronic disease. So the bottom of the pyramid, those young, healthy people, they're not so healthy. And guess what? They're not paying in. They're on disability. And you know what? Some of them are taken out. Like the people who are on dialysis. Okay? So what happens to a pyramid if you eat away at the base? The whole pyramid crumbles. And in fact, the Congressional Budget Office has said that by the year 2029, you can see here's the projected, that's what's going to happen with payable benefits. So basically, no Social Security for you. Now, I'll be honest with you. I'm going to be 66 in the year 2026 and 2029, and I want my friggin' Social Security. Okay? I worked for it. I worked hard for it. I want my friggin' Medicare, too. I worked hard for that. I paid in. And I'm not going to get out. And neither are you. Because of this.
Raise the income cap.
Yep. In fact, again, let's look at what the banks say. Because they don't have a horse in the race. So this is from Morgan Stanley, another global investment bank. And this is a report they published 2 years ago called actually 3 years ago, The Bittersweet Aftertaste of Sugar, where they modeled economic growth on the y-axis against the next 20 years based on a low sugar model, which we don't have in blue, against a high sugar model, which we do have in gold. And what you can see is that with the high sugar model, we reach a mean economic productivity of 0.0% by the year 2035. Now, who is that good for? Is that even good for the food industry? So this is a problem that the banks know, but Washington doesn't. And neither do you, but now you do. So, in fact, Credit Suisse, again, another report from 2013, Sugar Consumption at a Crossroads, and here's what they said about this issue. We believe higher taxation on sugary food and drinks would be the best option to reduce sugar intake and help fund the fast-growing healthcare costs associated with type 2 diabetes and obesity. A global investment bank is calling for taxation. Now, how effed up is that? But that's what we got. Well, it turns out San Francisco got it. And that's another reason I'm proud to live here and I'm proud to talk to all of you, because you got it. But you know who didn't get it? Chicago. Because they passed a tax and then they rescinded it. under pressure from the beverage industry just a month ago. They didn't get it. So not everyone gets it. In fact, National Geographic gets it. They published this, Sugar, Why We Can't Resist It. In fact, they have it absolutely right. We can't resist it. And the food industry knows that because they know when they add it, you buy more. It's the hook. It's the hook. It's the legal addiction. And that's where we're going. Everybody with me? That was 2013. They could have put cocaine in the food. In fact, they did. Till 1903. So they had to come up with something else. So now we have this thing called the opioid crisis, right? Trump declares opioid crisis a national emergency. Remember that just like 2 months ago? But requests no funds. Now, how are you going to fight that with no funds, right? And Jeff Sessions said people should just say no to opioids. So my question to you is, did Nancy Reagan's just say no work? That's why they're addictive. Because you can know that whatever it is that you're addicted to is ruining your health, your life, your family, and you can't do a damn thing about it because the biochemistry of the addictive substance alters your behavior so that you can't do anything about it. That's the definition of addiction. So just saying no ain't going to work. So this is useless, to say the least. So the question is, who does get this? Who gets this? I'm going to show you a clip, and you're going to love this. This is my favorite piece, my favorite 20 seconds in the history of television. You ready?
I couldn't get through a day without doing something to alter my consciousness.
And it started with heroin.
It started with sugar. Sugar? Oh, yeah. When I was 5, 6 years old, I was cramming sugar down my throat as fast as I could get it down. Sweets, you know, sugar on bread and butter. I became addicted to sugar because it changed the way I felt.
So there's Eric Clapton talking about how he got into heroin. Sugar is a gateway drug. You're laughing. I'm not. That's exactly what's going on. So, is food addictive? Is processed food addictive? Well, you know, a lot of authors are saying that, and some of them even have, like, degrees after their names. Okay? It's not all, like, junk. Okay, the question is, you know, what's the data? In fact, this book came out as a textbook called Food and Addiction back in 2012 by, you know, reputable psychiatrists and psychologists who are friends of mine, to be honest with you. So this concept, I'm going to pose to you that we have abdicated our responsibility based on addiction. So everybody recognize this document? What does it say? Everybody knows one clause. The whole world knows one clause from this document. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So my question to you is, like Ed Koch would say, how am I doing? How are we doing on each of those? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, let's look. So let's start with life. So here is the life expectancy of a whole bunch of different countries. And you can see, here's Niger, Ethiopia, Peru, they're all getting older. Life's, you know, I mean, as they've dealt with infectious diseases, they're sort of catching up, that's good. That's good. But here's the United States over here, and you notice we've been pretty flat, and in fact, we've actually gone down recently. In fact, U.S. life expectancy has now declined for the first time since 1993, 2 quarters in a row. First time that's ever happened. The median age of death has gone down by about 5 months over the last 6 months, from 78.6 down to 78.2 years. We are dying sooner. Now, heart disease is getting better, but diabetes is going through the friggin' roof. We're not dying of heart disease, we're dying of diabetes, chronic metabolic disease. So let's look at the death rates in the United States. So here's France, Germany, UK, Canada, Australia, Sweden. Everyone's death rate's going down. And here's United States Hispanics going down. But look who isn't going down. US whites. Death rates going up. And who among US whites? Ages 45 to 54. Middle-aged US whites. And what are they dying of? Poisonings and suicides. Poisonings and suicides in middle-aged US whites. That's the opioid crisis. Now, why is that happening? Illicit drug use up, marijuana, well, now it's legal, hallucinogens, illicit drugs, cocaine, etc. Here's illicit drug use in older adults. Older adults, we're not talking about teenagers here. Older adults, look at this, 50 to 54, double. Here's heroin and fentanyl deaths. Here's cocaine deaths. Here's deaths from benzodiazepines. And this next one is the worst. Are you ready? This one's the worst. Alcohol use disorder amongst women. Women. So, you always think of alcoholics as men, right? But look at this. From 2001 to 2012, a virtual doubling, an 83.7% increase in alcohol abuse disorder amongst women. And which women? The older, the worse. Why are older women becoming lushes? That's the question. You think that's okay? So why is that? Why is that their drug of choice? So, not doing too well on life. How about liberty? How are we doing there? So this is from Raj Chetty, who is an economist at Harvard University, a very brilliant guy. And he runs a project called the Equality of Opportunity Project. And I'm going to show you some data from that project. Here we have the prediction of whether or not you're going to have a higher income or a lower income than your parents, based on where you live, where you were born. Actually, where you were born, not where you live, but where you were born. Okay? And where you were born does seem to matter quite a bit, doesn't it? So let's look at New York City, where I'm from. Okay? So here's Bergen County over here on the west side of the Hudson River, and here's the Bronx over here on the east side of the Hudson River. Everybody familiar? George Washington Bridge connecting the two. Right? So if you grew up, were born and grew up in the Bronx, you have an 11% lower salary than your parents do if your parents were at the 25th percentile for income. Whereas if you grew up in Bergen, you have a 14% higher salary just across the bridge. Now you'd say, well, that's poor people. But what about the rich people? Let's look at the 75th percentile. Same thing. So we're trapped in our own ghettos that we make, whether it has graffiti or whether it has roses. We are all trapped in our own ghettos. So here are the 10 worst counties to be born in. Whatever you do. Oh, sorry, the 10 best counties to be born in, sorry, on this side. And here are the 10 worst counties to be born in. So whatever you do, don't move to Baltimore. Yeah, wow. Really. And finally, the pursuit of happiness. How are we doing on that? So let's look. Here we have ages 5 to 17, and we're looking at children's hospital admissions with a diagnosis of suicidal ideation or self-harm over a decade. Here are the number of patients, here are the number of encounters, and you can see how high that's gone. And the number of encounters in the clinic have tripled in the same time period. Kids are depressed. They want to hurt themselves, and we know that. This is my least favorite slide of the entire deck. Here we have suicides in children ages 10 to 14, okay? Young teenagers. You'll notice that motor vehicle accident deaths are going down significantly. But look what's gone up, suicide. So that suicides are now greater than motor vehicle accident deaths in this age group. You know why the motor vehicle accident deaths have gone down? Because the kids aren't being carted anywhere because they're home playing video games, getting depressed and killing themselves. Antidepressant use is up nationwide in females and in males. And it's up all over the world. This is the World Health Organization. 322 million people globally now have a diagnosis of clinical depression, an 18.5% increase in prevalence over a decade. And it's not because of increased awareness. It's because more people are sick. So my argument tonight, these four crises, the healthcare crisis, the Social Security crisis, the opioid crisis, the depression crisis, are really actually just four manifestations of one crisis. And when we understand that crisis, then we know how to deal with the four outcomes of that crisis. And that crisis is the systematic confusion and conflation within our society of these two words, pleasure and happiness. Now, they're both positive emotions. We like both of them. We want both of them in our lives. Can anybody give me the definitions of those two words? And how are they different? Anybody? So, pleasure is short-lived, happiness is long-lived. That's one. 6 more to go. Come on. Come on, this is San Francisco. You gotta be able to do this.
Sensual versus...
Huh?
Sensual versus internal.
Good. Pleasure is visceral. Happiness is ethereal. You know, pleasure you feel in your body, happiness you feel above the neck. Number 2, good job. Come on, come on. 5 more.
Personal versus social.
Getting there. Yeah, that's number 4. We're going to get there. Okay, it's like Family Feud. Survey says... No.
Pleasure feels good and happiness is good.
Almost. You're close. You're close. Pleasure is taking. Happiness is giving. Pleasure is experienced alone. Happiness is usually experienced in social groups. Pleasure is achievable with substances. Happiness is not achievable with substances. The extremes of pleasure, whether it be substances or behaviors, so substances like cocaine, heroin, nicotine, alcohol, sugar, or behaviors, shopping, gambling, internet, social media, porn. In the extreme, all lead to addiction. Every one of those has an aholic after it, right? Shopaholic, sexaholic, talkaholic, right? Whereas there's no such thing as being addicted to too much happiness. And finally, number 7, pleasure is dopamine and happiness is serotonin. 2 different biochemicals, 2 different neurotransmitters, 2 different chemicals that are used in the brain to convey information, 2 different sets of receptors, 2 different mechanisms of action. So you say, like, why do we care? So what? They both feel good. And what I would say is that understanding the difference between these two is exactly what you need to know, and exactly why we're in the mess we're in today. And I'll show you why. Before I do that, let's have a little levity. The MRI shows that your brain has been hijacked by dopamine pirates. You are now under the full control of social media, corporations, gambling, casinos, and big pharma. Are you writing me a prescription? No, I'm buying stock in those companies. And that's what we've done. That's not funny. I mean, it is, but it isn't. So why do we care? Here's why we care. Dopamine is an excitatory neurotransmitter. When it's released from one neuron to the next, which happens in an area of the brain called the reward center or the nucleus accumbens, it's a specific area of the brain which we can see with fancy MRIs and PET scanners. When dopamine is released, it excites the next neuron. Now that's important. And the reason is because neurons like to be excited. That's why they have receptors in the first place, but they like to be tickled, not bludgeoned. Chronic overstimulation of any neuron leads to neuronal cell death. And we know that from all the kids who have chronic seizure disorders who end up frying their brains, which, I used to take care of until 3 months ago when I clinically retired. Okay? So overstimulation of neurons is not good. So to protect themselves, the second neuron, the receiving neuron, has a option B, a fail-safe, a method of self-defense. What it does is it downregulates the number of receptors that it has for that transmitter, specifically to try to limit its exposure. Everybody got that? That's on purpose. It does that on purpose. So what does it mean in human terms? What it means is you get a hit, you get a rush, receptors go down. Next time, you need a bigger hit to get the same rush because there are fewer receptors, and the receptors go down. And then a bigger hit, a bigger hit, a bigger hit, a bigger hit, until finally you get a huge hit to get nothing. That's called tolerance. And then when the neurons start to die, that's called addiction. So every substance, every behavior that stimulates dopamine has as its endpoint addiction. That's why it matters. So far, so good? So let me prove it. Here we have cocaine, meth, alcohol, heroin, and here are the dopamine receptors in that area called the nucleus accumbens. And this is in a control brain, and here's in an addicted brain. So what you see here is the dopamine binding to lots of receptors over here in a non-drug abuser versus dopamine only binding to a couple of receptors because they're way down in the drug abuser. Everybody got the picture now? Well, take a look at what happens if you look at obesity. So here's a control brain, and here's an obese brain. Same thing. Same phenomenon. Okay? And that's the degree of binding, because there are fewer receptors. So that's what's going on with dopamine. However, serotonin, this other neurotransmitter, the neurotransmitter of contentment, or happiness, if you will, is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It doesn't stimulate the next neuron. It actually puts the next neuron to rest. So, can you kill it if you put it to rest? So do you have to downregulate your receptors? No. So serotonin does not downregulate its own receptor. But there's one thing, and so you can't overdose on too much happiness, but there's one thing that downregulates serotonin. Dopamine. So the more pleasure you seek, the more unhappy you get. Oh. And then throw a soupçon of stress on top of it, and I'll show you what happens then. And things get even worse. Because what stress does, it inactivates the part of your brain which controls the dopamine and makes it worse. It's called the prefrontal cortex, the part in the front, the executive function part, the Jiminy Cricket of your brain that keeps you from doing stupid things, puts it into suspended animation and makes the dopamine run rampant. And at the same time, it makes the serotonin receptors go down. so you can derive less contentment from whatever it is you're experiencing. And that's the path, the cycle of addiction and depression. So here's the dopamine pathway here. Here's where it starts. It starts in this little nucleus here called the ventral tegmental area. That's where the cell bodies are. Here's that nucleus accumbens, that reward center. And then you have this area over here called the prefrontal cortex. And the dopamine and the prefrontal cortex are in reciprocal relationship with each other. Here's the contentment pathway. It starts in a different area of the brain called the dorsal raphe here, and it innervates the entire brain. Notice the dopamine didn't do that, right? Dopamine did not do that. The serotonin does. Okay? And then you have this stress, fear, memory pathway. And that prefrontal cortex is basically inhibiting an area of your brain called the amygdala. And the amygdala is your stress center. When you walk down a deserted street at 3 a.m., your amygdala is what you're feeling. Everybody got the idea? Okay, that anxiety about what might happen, whether there's somebody in that, alley or not. Okay, that's the amygdala. Okay, and these two areas are in reciprocal contact with each other. You also have the hippocampus, which is your memory center. That's the part of your brain when you put your hand down on the stove when you were 3 years old. Okay, that's the part you remember. Okay, that's there. Okay, everybody got that? So these are in reciprocal relationship with each other. And it turns out that BMI, or weight, or obesity, is in inverse association with that prefrontal cortex. So the heavier you are, the less well it's working. And in part because of this dopamine phenomenon. So here's the thesis, if you will, the whole book on one slide. Here's what we've done to our society. Technology, processed food, sugar, sleep deprivation, and drugs. All of those drive dopamine. But dopamine lowers its own receptor. And so this is the vicious pathway of tolerance. Throw some stress on top, which inactivates the inhibitory mechanism, and you end up with addiction. Conversely, all of these things contribute to metabolic syndrome, all those chronic metabolic diseases, which lowers serotonin. Add some stress, which lowers the receptor for that serotonin, and now you can't even conduct that feeling of contentment, and that's depression. So addiction and depression are two sides of the same coin, born out of what has happened to our environment.
Could you throw shopping on that list too?
Sure. We'll throw shopping on there too. You bet. So, to summarize what I've told you, addiction is excessive reward from too much dopamine, which downregulates its own receptors, adds some stress, and you get diminution of pleasure. Depression is deficient contentment because of not enough serotonin. Metabolic syndrome downregulates serotonin. The stress reduces the number of receptors, and therefore you get diminution of happiness too. And we have both. So, the hack. The question is, where it come from? Who perpetrated this hack upon us? Why is this nonfiction disguised as fiction? That's the question. And I'm going to argue that this is industry-driven and government-sanctioned, that this is willful, not accidental, and it's very well orchestrated, and it's a plot, not a conspiracy, because a conspiracy would require collusion between industry actors, specifically to cause our detriment. I'm not arguing that. What I'm arguing is that every single industry has figured out, for its own sake, how to increase its market share. Not talking to any of the other companies, but they're all doing the same thing because it works. And it's engineered with a profit motive only. It's only about the money. Only about the money. Okay, here's an example. Everybody familiar with this, right? 10-year campaign by Coca-Cola, Open Happiness. Okay, longest running campaign in the history of the company. Why? Because it worked. Any happiness in that bottle? Sugar, caffeine, dopamine. Anything else? Water, phosphoric acid, caramel coloring. Huh? Aspartame. Well, that's Diet Coke. Yeah, All right, but you get the idea. Nothing in there. It used to be cocaine. Yeah, right. It used to be cocaine. That's why it's called Coca-Cola, right? Okay. How about this one? A little closer to home. The road to your happy place is paved with raisins and flakes and pavement. In other words, get off your fat ass, it's your fault. That's what that says. For Raisin Bran. Now, Raisin Bran's healthy, right? No. Are those the raisins in Raisin Bran? Those are the raisins in Raisin Bran. In fact, 18 grams of sugar. When you do the math on the number of raisins, and I did this, in a cup of Raisin Bran, okay, there is 9 grams of sugar in the raisins, which means that 9 grams of sugar has been added in the form of these, the sugar coating on these to make them sweeter so that you would eat it. And if you like Raisin Bran Crunch, we have 29 grams of sugar for you, and sugar is second to the wheat. Brown sugar syrup, corn syrup, honey. Yeah. Now let's look at Nestle. Okay, they actually have a wellness website, and they have a wellness objective. And they say here, and this is correct, this is actually truth. Studies show that happiness and health are intimately linked together. The healthier you are, the happier you'll be, and vice versa. And that is true. I won't argue that. But then comes this part. Happiness comes from spending time with loved ones, fostering relationships, or learning how to cope with stress or depression. Agreed. So does happiness and health translate? In other words, if you're happy, are you healthy? So there's a study called the UK Million Women Study where they ask this question. Does happiness actually affect mortality? And the answer is no. It doesn't. You can be the most crotchety old you-know-what, and that's not going to make you dead. Okay? So don't think your uncle is going to die anytime soon. What does affect mortality are the behaviors that come from your unhappiness. The hedonic behaviors that you engage in order to try to mollify your unhappiness. That's what kills you, not the unhappiness itself. So what does Nestle do? Okay, here's what they do. They want to sell you both sugary snacks and diabetes pills. They're getting into the pharma business so they can create the disease in order to treat it. And in fact, they've done that all over the world. This was in the New York Times, how big business got Brazil hooked on junk food, all about Nestle and these promotoras going around to these, favelas, peddling Nestle products. How about the Happy Meal? Not so happy. Okay? 1.5 billion toys worldwide. Okay, and there they are. Oh, Disney stopped selling them in 2006, to their credit. The good news is there are fewer Happy Meals sold. The bad news is the kids are ordering off the dollar menu instead. Not a big win. Okay? And the toy thing, we have the toy ban here in San Francisco, right? You have to pay a dime for the toy. It's not free with the Happy Meal. Okay? After San Francisco instituted the toy ban, 3 states banned toy bans. Yeah, later. How about happy hour? It's 5 o'clock somewhere. You know where it's 5 o'clock? It's 5 o'clock at 10 o'clock on NBC. Why do you think that alcohol abuse is up 83.7% in older women? Because they've been told it's okay. That's why. And this is particularly pernicious because Hoda is a breast cancer survivor. And alcohol leads to breast cancer. And there was just an article in Nature yesterday that shows how. And this one. Red Bull? Not done.
Bring me down. Can't none
Oh, Henry.
bring me down. Your love is too
Not sure what that one is.
down. Can't none bring
Not
me
done.
down. I said, take now. Bring me down. Can't none bring me down. Your love
And
is
tape
too
just.
bring me down. Can't none bring me down. I said.
So, my question to you is, if you're drinking Red Bull at midnight in South Central LA in a convenience store, how happy are you? And that's only going to cause sleep deprivation, which is only going to make you more unhappy. That's called product placement, people. That's on purpose. That ain't by accident. How about this? Let's add some stress. What do you think? That's stress, right? Will you be ready? Men, don't be ready because, you know, your name might be mentioned on network TV tonight. How about more stress? How about sleep deprivation, right? We all got that. And technology that causes sleep deprivation. Let's look a little more carefully at this. Everybody see this article came out in Axios from Sean Parker, co-founder of Facebook? We built Facebook to exploit you. In fact, he says very specifically, exploiting a vulnerability in human psychology. We need to sort of give you a little dopamine hit every once in a while because someone liked or commented on a photo or a post or whatever. It's on purpose. And I'll prove it to you. Who here uses Gmail?
Uses what?
Gmail. Yeah, quite a few of you. Ever notice that when you open up your mail, it takes about 1.5 to 2 seconds for the new emails to populate? You think Google's just slow? That's been baked in. That's engineered in to give you a dopamine hit to the anticipation, to keep you coming back to check it and check it and check it some more. Now, I'm not saying all technology is bad. Like, for instance, who here uses their GPS? Has it ever saved your life? Saved mine. Okay? But you keep checking it? Because it's the same every time you check it. You need variable reward. It has to be different every time. And God knows emails and likes are different every time, and that's on purpose. In fact, there's a company that's actually called dopamine.com. Okay? Dopamine makes your app addictive. They'll actually program your app that you make in order to drive addiction. And there's a 4-step cycle to addiction. This is from Nir Eyal's book. He's an intranet entrepreneur down in the valley called Hooked, How to Market Habit-Forming Products. And there are 4 parts to it. The first is called the trigger, or the itch, if you will. It's got to be an acceptable itch in society, like, for instance, your email going off in your pocket, which leads to the action, which is the proverbial scratch, which is like checking your email, which currently is still socially acceptable. I think it should not be. Okay, that should be done behind closed doors. In fact, if you text and walk in Honolulu, you get a ticket now, which I think is very good. We should be doing that all over the country. Okay? The third part is variable reward. So it can't be the same every time. Okay, so your likes, your emails, you know, it's got to be something good, something bad, like Overstock or Groupon. Those are addictive on purpose because they're supplying you with something and they're actually increasing stress. Got to do it now or it's going to go away. How about the airlines? How many of you have shopped fares online only to find out when you come back 10 minutes later after you've actually checked with your family that the price went up? You think that's by accident? And then finally, the only one they care about, investment. Okay? You got to plunk down $1,000 for a new iPhone. In fact, we know this because we've done the studies. Now, Mark Zuckerberg says, well, yes, Facebook is addictive, but it's only addictive for the people who are depressed. The people who are depressed are the problem. Okay? So, correlational studies show that people who are depressed use more Facebook than people who are not depressed, which is true. That is true. But that's correlation, not causation. In order to do causation, you have to do time lag studies. Well, we've done them, and here they are. Okay? In fact, if you're depressed, yes, moment to moment and long term, you are going to decrease your life satisfaction and emotional well-being if you start out depressed. But even if you're not, you still do. Now, not to the same degree. This is the chi-square value. Okay? But it's still highly significant. Everyone gets more depressed on Facebook. Okay? The whole world gets more depressed on Facebook. This isn't a good thing. It's a bad thing, a very bad thing. And it's very bad for our children, who are the ones who are committing suicide over it. In fact, just 2 days ago, iPhones and children are a toxic pair, say two big Apple investors, JANA Partners and California Retirement System, and Zuckerberg's dilemma when Facebook's success is bad for society, indeed. Anybody know who this guy is? His name's Tristan Harris, and he's a former Google exec who left the company because Google was actually building addiction into its products, like Gmail, and he knew it. And he now runs a nonprofit called Time Well Spent. And he is going to be one of the keynotes, and I'm going to be the other keynote at a meeting in Washington 2 weeks from now on tech addiction. Jean Twenge down at UC San Diego wrote a book called iGen about this whole phenomenon and wrote this article in The Atlantic, Have Smartphones Destroyed a Generation? Indeed, they have. And Common Sense Media and Kaiser are sponsoring this tech addiction seminar workshop in DC, and Cory Booker is going to be there, as well as Katie Couric. Okay. So here we are. Tech, processed food, sugar, sleep deprivation, drugs, all the things that have happened to our society, except they haven't just happened. They've been engineered to happen. They're not by accident. Driving, addiction and depression, consuming health care, killing Social Security, and at the root of the opioid and depression crises in America. So, what can we do about it? Okay, so reward is not contentment, and pleasure is not happiness. Reward is dopamine, contentment is serotonin. Chronic excess reward interferes with contentment. Stress drives reward at the expense of contentment. And business has intentionally conflated those two terms, pleasure and happiness, so that you think they mean the same thing. Because that is how they get you to buy their crap. You're unhappy, you need this. And you need more of it. In fact, Mark Zuckerberg, when faced with this, do you know what he said the cure to Facebook was? More Facebook. To engage in hedonic behaviors that are profitable to them, not to you. Government legislation and Supreme Court decisions have actually made it easier to buy that junk and engage in those behaviors. And I had to take those slides out, otherwise we'd be here for 3 hours. Individuals in society have become fat, sick, stupid, broke, addicted, depressed, and most decidedly unhappy. So, what can we do about it? Well, there are some things you, yourself, sitting in that chair right now, can do about it for yourself. They're called the 4 C's. They're all evidence-based. They're all clinically proven to work. They all up your serotonin, tamp down your dopamine, and lower your cortisol, or your money back. Except none of them cost anything, so don't look for a refund. And they're all things your mother told you, but you forgot while you were quaffing that Coca-Cola while texting your BFF. First, connect. Now, what does that mean, connect? That means face-to-face, eye-to-eye, in your face connection. That's what that means. Why? Why does it have to be in person? Reason? You have a set of neurons in the back of your head called mirror neurons. And what those mirror neurons are doing is they're reading the facial expressions of the person you're talking to in real time and translating that into emotion so that you end up adopting the emotions of the person you're talking to. Paul Ekman, psychologist at UC Berkeley, went to Papua New Guinea. They never saw white people, never saw any people. They had the same facial expressions for the same emotions as we did. It's baked in. It's part of our DNA. So your brain is interpreting that signal in real time. And what that does is it generates a process that ups your serotonin. It has a name. It's called empathy. And if you can't do that, you're a psychopath. Think about it. How about religion? Turns out religion's kind of the best way to explain this whole damn thing. Okay? I don't care if you believe in religion or not. Irrelevant. There are 4,200 religions on the planet. You think any of them got it right? If any of them got it right, there'd only be one. But every religion on the planet, all 4,200, have one thing in common. Community, a meeting place, a place where you see other people. Okay? The place where you belong, a place where you are see and be seen. Okay? And that's on purpose. Because that's the serotonin. Turns out, what the religion is espousing is the dopamine, the vitriol, the anger, the xenophobia, the jealousy. That's the dopamine. And how do we know this? We know this because patients with Parkinson's disease who have defects in dopamine neurons, and there are two parts of the brain that have dopamine neurons. One's the reward center, and the other one's called the substantia nigra, which is in charge of gross motor movements. They have problems with both. We started treating these patients with L-Dopa, precursor to dopamine, to make them better back in the early 70s. And they got better from their motor disturbance, which is good, and we still do it. We give patients Cinemet today for that reason. Okay? But what we found out was that a significant, about 20 to 30% of patients became either compulsive gamblers or religious zealots. There's a whole literature on dopamine excess from pharmacotherapy for Parkinson's disease. So it's the zealotry is the dopamine. The community is the serotonin. Kind of cool when you think about it. Interpersonal face-to-face connection, that's what you're looking for, empathy. But social media generates dopamine. And worse yet, you end up in this thing called an echo chamber. You've heard about those? What do you think that is? That's just making dopamine go right out of control and upping your stress. And studies show that Facebook use leads to social isolation and depression. Sherry Turkle at MIT, a media watcher, very famous, and I subscribe to this entirely. She coined the term alone together. That's what we are today, alone together. Number two, second C, contribute. Now, what does that mean? It means outside of yourself. Contributing to your IRA is not contribution. Okay? Outside of yourself, to others, not for gain. Boy Scout badges is not contribution. Padding your bank account is not contribution. Lottery winners are not happy. Those who value financial success derive less contentment, and saving generates more contentment than spending by a lot. And spending money on yourself increases your pleasure, makes you a consumer. In fact, that's what we're now called, the consumer price index, right? We're all consumers. We stopped being individuals, and now we're consumers. They want us to be consumers. That's what they're doing. And that's how we judge it. It's called gross domestic product, GDP. It's based on consumption. Okay? That's how we measure progress, except it's not. Okay? Increase, and that's what spending money on others makes you an individual. That's called charity. And that increases happiness. Can you derive happiness from your work? Everyone wants to know. And the answer is yes, you can, if you can see how your work helps others and your boss can see it too. If that's the case, you can use your work for happiness. I used to. That was my job at UCSF. But not everybody has that opportunity, okay? In which case, then, we have other methods, like altruism, volunteerism, philanthropy. Anything that contributes to the greater good will up your serotonin and tamp down your dopamine. Number 3, cope. Now, cope means 3 specific things: sleep, mindfulness, and exercise. Because all of those are exercise for your prefrontal cortex. That's what you're doing. You're exercising your prefrontal cortex. Okay? Sleep deprivation increases the amygdala and puts the prefrontal cortex to sleep. 35% of adults get less than 7 hours of sleep per night, and 23% have clinical insomnia. And some of those have obstructive sleep apnea, which makes it even worse. And caffeine reduces sleep and increases your dopamine, only to make things worse. The word of the millennium, multitasking. If you're not a multitasker, you lose your job. Everyone has to be a multitasker today, be able to do 5 things at once. Turns out only 2.5% of the population can actually multitask. The rest of us are all serial unitaskers, switching from one thing to another so fast, and every time that happens, you get a cortisol bump, making things worse. But that's what is prized. We've created that. Okay? Screens are the antithesis of sleep, in part because of the stress and the blue light activating the midbrain. My colleague Chris Madsen at UC Berkeley showed that kids who charge their cell phone in their room get 28 minutes less sleep per night than kids who charge their cell phone outside their room. You're going, why do you think? And smartphone apps for wellness have not yet shown benefit. 27,000 apps for wellness. None of them work. Because they're all providing data, not information. None of them have figured out how to actually take that data and actually use it for something that actually helps you. Mindfulness activates the prefrontal cortex. That's why meditation works, because you are focusing on one thing. Okay? Improves metabolic health, alleviates depression. And it turns out exercise is as good as SSRIs at alleviating depression. Problem is getting somebody who's depressed to exercise. That's the tough part. And finally, cook. There's our next president on the cover there. Why cook? Because there are 3 items in food that actually matter to up your serotonin. First one, tryptophan, the precursor to serotonin. The rarest amino acid in the diet. So what has it? Fish, eggs, poultry. Not things commonly found in processed food. Okay, so you're not getting very much if you're eating processed food. Processed food is low in tryptophan, low in omega-3 fatty acids, which are anti-inflammatory. And it's been shown that the serotonin boutons in the brain have an inflammatory haze around them in omega-3 deficient animals, and it goes away when you give them the omega-3, so you improve neurotransmission. And then finally, high sugar. Sugar ups your dopamine like crazy, downs your serotonin. So a low tryptophan, low omega-3, high sugar diet, that's called processed food. A high tryptophan, high omega-3, low sugar diet, that's called real food. Problem is, 1/3 of Americans don't know how to cook. And if you don't know how to cook, you're hostage to the food industry for the rest of your life. And that's where we are. Okay? Real food matters. And the real food movement is in high gear. And companies who don't change will be left in the dust unless they are bought up and kill the startups. And we will see what Amazon does with Whole Foods. Campbell's Soup broke with the Grocery Manufacturers Association of America on this issue of real food. Cooking is all things at once. It's connecting over a meal with your friends or family, not your extended family. That's called Thanksgiving. Forget that. Contributing, coping, because it's mindful, because you actually have to pay attention, and cooking. Sitting down, cooking a meal, and sharing it with your family is the single best thing you can do for yourselves, and no one's doing it. So, what can we do societally or professionally? So, 5 modest proposals for you to ponder. First, at UCSF, we've gotten rid of sodas, the Healthy Beverage Initiative. At Swedish Hospital in Seattle, they've gotten rid of juice. And just today, the NHS in Britain has banned sodas and sweet beverages from all hospitals in all of the UK. Today. January 9th, 2018. Wow. Holy crap. And you know why they did that? Because we did it here at UCSF. They did it. Wow. Proposal number 2. Let's call type 2 diabetes what it really is. You know, diabetes is an Egyptian Greek word, means siphon. Do you know that? Because you're peeing your brains out the whole day, you know? Like, let's call it what it is. Oh, you got processed food disease. Think that might make a difference in how people dealt with it? Because that's what it is. Proposal number 3. Let's roll back the subsidies for all the things that are killing us. These are all commodity crops. It's a legacy from 1933, the original Farm Bill, when we had the Dust Bowl and the Depression, when we needed storable food. Today, we don't need storable food. It's actually killing us. So people say, well, that'll make prices go up like crazy. Not true. So this is from UC Berkeley, the Giannini Foundation, Farm Subsidies and Obesity in the United States. And they actually modeled what food would look like if we got rid of all food subsidies. And it turns out the only things that would go up, corn and sugar. Exactly what we want to go up.
Goldman Sachs Commodities Futures Index makes people starve around the world. They manipulate the
Indeed.
price of food.
Indeed. Proposal number 4, a trust mark. So if you see this in a restaurant, you know that whatever they're serving can't kill you. Okay? And then competitors will say, wait, we're losing business to people who are serving real food. Maybe we need to serve real food. This is our nonprofit that I mentioned at the beginning, Eat Real. And finally, oh, and so, by the way, UCSF cafeteria is Real certified. So is Boulder Valley School District. We're trying to do that here. And finally, number 5, let's get sugar off the generally recognized as safe list, because it's not safe. It's just like alcohol. The reason kids are getting type 2 diabetes and fatty liver disease today is because those are the diseases of alcohol. But kids don't drink alcohol. And the reason is because sugar and alcohol are metabolized exactly the same way in the liver, causing that fatty liver disease I showed you, and driving all the chronic metabolic diseases we know of today. So, in summary, we have solved the healthcare crisis. We have solved the Social Security crisis. We have solved the opioid crisis. We have solved the depression crisis. And I hope I've made you happy you came. Thank you.